My name is Catherine Fitzgerald Wyatt, and I'm the Education and Outreach Manager here at the Library of Virginia. We are delighted to welcome a really nice contingent from the Maggie Walker site, and I'm going to turn it over to Acting Superintendent Van Knowles to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Vance Knowles. I'm the Acting Superintendent of Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site. And on behalf of myself and all the park staff here today, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the presentation of the Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site Administrative History by Megan Taylor Shockley. Maggie Lena Taylor was almost forgotten by history. And for an African American woman born in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, and who lived her entire life in the Jim Crow South, it's hard to believe that Ms. Walker's legacy as an advocate for civil rights and gender equality, as a community leader, as a teacher, as a philanthropist, as a pioneering businesswoman in Richmond's Jackson Ward, it's hard to believe that her legacy was almost forgotten. But it wasn't. And we're here today because in the 1970s, a group of African American residents in Richmond had a vision for sharing Ms. Walker's story. And as fortune would have it, the National Park Service was beginning also to focus on important, untold, and inclusive stories in America. This confluence of ideas and commitment and passion led to the creation of the first public site dedicated to preserving and interpreting the legacy of an African American woman, and that is Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site. So administrative histories, such as the one today, they chronicle and establish the evolution of parks, and they capture the achievements, the challenges, the disappointments that parks face along the way. They're intended to inform future park managers of where we've been and where we can go. And it's not just for the park, this is a public document. So students, academics, journalists, if they're researching the history of the NPS management practices, they're there for everybody. So before we start, I'd like to recognize and thank a few folks. I'd like to thank the Library of Virginia for hosting this. All our community partners and friends of the park, which we would not be here without them. I'd like to recognize the Mickens family, some of whom are with us today. I know Liza, your great-great-granddaughter of Maggie L. Walker. That's amazing. And I'd like to thank the Park Service staff, past and present, for all their contributions to this endeavor, which was not an easy one. This is years in the making, and I know that I believe everything was done during COVID.
Pretty much.
So it is not an easy undertaking. So I'd like to introduce Megan Taylor Shockley. She's a retired research professor of history at Clemson, where she taught courses in museum studies, heritage tourism, digital history, and women's history. She's the co-author of Changing History, Virginia Women Through 4 Centuries, author of We Too Are Americans, African American Women in Detroit and Richmond, 1940 to 1954, and of The Captain's Widow of Sandwich, Self-Invention and the Life of Hannah Rebecca Burgess, 1836 to 1917. She also co-authored administrative histories for Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, and she sits on the boards of various Richmond organizations, including Friends of University of Richmond Libraries and the Shepherd's Center of Richmond. And as if that's not enough, her latest journey, she's a realtor in Richmond, and apparently very successful and love what she does. So good on you.
Thank you.
So I will turn it over to you.
All right, I'm not checking my phone, I promise. This is the mic. So I have to kind of hold it down with the pocket. Yeah, I'm a great realtor if you really like Richmond history, because otherwise my clients get lessons they didn't even know they were going to. Not many realtors know the history of Richmond like I do. I'm just gonna say that straight up. All right. So, just before I get started, how many of y'all staff have actually read this? Okay, so not too bad. Good, that's good. So it's going to be review for you. But so I have done administrative histories. I did one of Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, and they can be really tedious. I'm not going to lie. Like for a lot of you, it's going to be skimming through a lot of stuff you didn't want to know about why they decided to mow lawns at certain times, and a lot about repointing brick. But this one is really interesting because for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's about Maggie Walker and her legacy. It's about how involved the community was in getting this site up and established. And I think it also reflects really one of the best National Park Service projects out there because it was created at a time when, as you said, the Park Service was refashioning itself. It recognized that really there were just too many things going on with old white dude history, as I like to call it. They need a much more inclusive narrative about the history of this country. So these national trends in the National Park Service met up with local community preservation efforts, which were very much a part of the 1970s boom in African American history. So it's this idea of reclaiming sites of importance that are not just sites for one group in the community, they are sites that are reflecting all of our history. And that's another important point. So, and I will tell you, all these pictures can be found at National Park Service site or in the administrative history, which is, if it's not available online yet, it will be. So y'all can read it, you can download it. It's a free ebook that is available to all of you if you want to learn the really nitty-gritty details of preservation, which again, most of you probably aren't so interested in, so I can talk about it a little bit at the end if you want to. But you may or may not know the actual story of the foundation of this particular site, and I think it's fascinating. So in 1975, a group of citizens, many residents or former residents of Jackson Ward, and community leaders came together to save the Maggie Walker house. It was a reaction against a lot of development that was slated for Jackson Ward, and there had already been one historic building torn down. Now, I'm not going to get into the decimation of Jackson Ward. You all know about that. And if you don't, there are great books, and I have in the bibliography studies on what happened to Jackson Ward, environmental racism that caused this vibrant community to decline in the 60s and 70s. But at this time, this group said, we've got to save this house. So they band together to form the Maggie L. Walker Historical Foundation with the purpose and plan to create a new city museum, a new city house museum. So they met with City Council. City Council came on board. They were going to apply for housing and urban development funding, as well as some other funding sources to purchase and renovate the house and restore it back. So in the time that they decided to do this, in the ensuing time, they hired a guy named Vincent DeForest. Some of you may be familiar with his work, a consultant from Washington, D.C., who had been doing studies of significant African American history sites. He also had been working with the National Park Service to identify these sites, because the Park Service had initiated a plan to incorporate new sites, again, to tell better histories, more complete histories of the United States. So he was hired by the city and the foundation to do a local study, a feasibility study for a local city museum that would be run by the Historical Foundation. Well, unbeknownst to the city and the Historical Foundation, DeForest started talking to the National Park Service about the possibility of including this site into the pantheon of National Park Service sites. So the council and the Historical Foundation only found this out when they were trying to figure out why this report was so late in coming. DeForest was late in sending the report in. And that is when he basically fessed up that he had been in communication in pretty high-level talks with the National Park Service to acquire the site. So it was sort of like a surprise to the city and the foundation. But this initiative basically launched the partnership and created the site that we know today. So the Park Service determined it absolutely did want the site. And the reason it is a site within the larger Richmond National Battlefield Park Service grouping is because it's kind of small for its own site to have its own superintendent. There were conversations about that. And it also benefited from the pretty good funding that was already going to the entire grouping of parks here in the area. So there were conversations about that. So they determined to bring it into what was already existing here. And at this point, the Park Service engaged in conversations with the Historical Foundation and actually created a memorandum of understanding that stated quite plainly they would be working with the Historical Foundation to help staff the site. A lot of the early volunteers were members of the Historical Foundation, to share the research and to really get the site up and running. So we have this new partnership between the foundation that will provide a lot of publicity. These are well-known people. They were able to secure funding and donations as well as volunteers and government money. This was at a time when in the late 70s, the government spent a lot of money acquiring new Park Service sites. And in fact, the Maggie Walker site was part of the 1978 Park Omnibus Bill that incorporated a massive amount of new sites into the umbrella of the National Park Service. So I'm not going to say it was without conflict. There were some interesting conversations. The Historical Foundation wanted to hire a director for the museum, and that's not how the Park Service works. So there had to be a conversation about the Park Service hire staff, and the foundation would advise. So the MOU basically talks about the Historical Foundation as an advisory board to the staff that were on site. And it's really a wonderful thing, I think, that the Park Service took over this home because it provided pretty much immediate funding that was really critical. Just to give you an idea of also of what we're looking at in Jackson Ward, a lot of you I know here probably grew up in and around Jackson Ward or at least visited back in the 20th century, late 20th century. But here's a picture of what it looked like when the National Park Service came on the scene. So we've got the corner. So this is Quality Row here. You can see the corner of the Maggie Walker house here. And the Exxon station was still there, which National Park Service did try to acquire and was not able to do so. This is the streetscape of 2nd Street, corner of 2nd and Lee. So lots of boarded up businesses. And right next to it, you can see the white building. That's the Eggleston Motel, where by this point it was already pretty derelict. A lot of illicit activities going on there, according to the staff who came in. And in fact, there were a lot of drugs and other issues, particularly in this block, when the National Park Service came on site. Just to, again, give you an idea of what it was like in Jackson Ward, over 70% of the homes in Jackson Ward were rented in 1978. All of the buildings on this block, except for one that was rented to a tenant, a long-term tenant, were vandalized mostly or abandoned. So these are abandoned properties, except for the one renter. And there's a lot of poverty in Jackson Ward, and we know there still are serious problems in Jackson Ward, of course also with gentrification, but the average income of residents in Jackson Ward of a resident at this time was $4,900 a year as opposed to $8,670 for an average Richmonder. In fact, there were no historic sites at this point designated as National Historic Sites or Virginia Historic Sites except for 3rd Street Bethel, and that was the only one. So we've got these amazing structures in Jackson Ward. They're falling into disrepair, lots of absentee landlords. And this is, again, what the foundation was targeting. Foundation plan, once the National Park Service came in, was to fix this site, save this house, and then move on to others. So it was never just the house itself. It was a large-scale plan to restore many buildings of significance in Jackson Ward. So it was pretty ambitious. So the other thing that I should point out about just this time and this period of history is this is a period of reclaiming the stories of African American history just generally. More scholars focused on it. And also, we have a lot of people who are deciding that, yeah, this is absolutely worth saving. However, a lot of institutions had failed, and this is a problem that's ongoing, failed to save the records of African American institutions and people. So Maggie Walker's story was not as well known as it should have been because the archives weren't really there to support the telling of the story by scholars at this time. And so not a lot was actually known about Walker's life, not like we know today. A lot of what we did know was conjecture, and a lot of what we knew was also kind of urban legend. I like to think of this as possibly part of the culture of dissemblance that many, many middle class and upper class African American women engaged in. It was a way to, so they kept their private lives private as a way to maintain control in a white-dominated society. So stories abounded about Maggie Walker that simply were not true, but it's hard to really know. And even today, it's really hard to get at feelings, what she felt. She didn't write it down a lot. So that, again, it is a protective mechanism. And Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham came up with that concept of the politics of respectability. And Darlene Clark Hine talked about the respectability politics causes this dissemblance that shades us. Like it protects them, but it also keeps the public from really knowing what these women were doing. And it's pretty amazing what they were doing, as we know now. So some of the myths or misconceptions were Maggie Walker as the first ever woman bank president. We did not know her birth date. And of course, Elvatrice Belches was here at the Library of Virginia and discovered that it was not necessarily what Maggie Walker said it was. And that was not till the 21st century. We did not know the status of her father, what he was really all about. And in fact, early stories talked about him as an abolitionist, which he absolutely was not. And so, again, the Park Service and historians now tell a much more accurate picture. But this is the kind of narrative that the Park Service is coming into as they are trying to create an accurate interpretation of this house museum. So we have physical problems, and we have problems with a narrative that was really unquestioned, but also not based in fact. And those facts had been hidden, and also those facts were hard to come by at this time in 1978 when they came in. So the Walker property, this is exactly what it looked like. These are pictures from the site planning. And again, when I say derelict, this is the courtyard. So when the Park Service purchased the home, this is what they're looking at in the back. I mean, to me, that's overwhelming. I can't even imagine. The garage was falling down. The garage is up here. And the awnings were missing. And this is just the exterior. The interior of the home was also, not particularly well cared for. So there were leaks in the roof, and again, as a realtor, I can tell you leaks and like roofs and crawl spaces or basements are like the bane of my existence. So problems in all of these. Termite ridden, joists were rotted, massive water damage upstairs and had gone down. So the inside was really in pretty bad shape as well. Of course, everything was outdated, electricity, plumbing, anything you would need to make this a safe space for visitors to come to. So the National Park Service, of course, over the course of the decades, spent millions of dollars, but right away engaged structural engineers. And the priority was to stabilize this structure, get it fit for walking around in, and start the interpretive process. So the Park Service also received, with the enabling legislation, a larger boundary than just the Walker House. And this was in order to preserve the streetscape. One of the reasons I love Jackson Ward is because it is so well preserved on so many blocks. You can really see what it was like at the time. So what you'll see is this boundary I wish they'd kind of gone all the way down to First Street, the whole block there with the buildings. But instead, these little long rectangular boxes are actually the facades. So the enabling legislation took the facades of these buildings as part of the national boundary. Now, I read through a lot of material. There's no evidence that anyone ever was able to create an easement for the facades, which means anyone could technically come in and mess it up. But there had been conversations over the decades to figure out a way to maintain the facades as they are, as you see them today. So the boundary extended to the facades, and also on the corner of 2nd Street was that Exxon station, and then all the way to 3rd. So once the Park Service purchased the Walker House from the descendants, particularly Maggie Laura Walker Lewis, Dr. Maggie Walker Lewis, they set about to buy the houses. 110.5 is Maggie Walker's house, to buy all of the buildings that you see in that big rectangle that are shaded. So that would include the derelict 2nd 2 Street block with a laundromat that was closed, the store that was closed, the restaurant that had been shuttered, and then 116, 118 had been turned into an office building. Actually, it's where Oliver Hill's office was. So there's a beauty parlor over there. And so they purchased all of those. And I'll just tell you, I don't have the exact numbers. You can look them up in the book if you'd like. But you know how much property in Jackson Ward goes for now? These were like $17,000. Now, again, they're derelict. They're vandalized, abandoned. They're a mess. But they were getting these row homes for $17,000, 17 to 20. So, yeah, that was a big deal. So they got that whole section there. And right away, again, this has taken a lot of money. They're just spending money up front, tens of thousands of dollars, to simply acquire and then stabilize the house. That was the big plan at first. But also, in addition to this, we've got plans going on to develop the site. And this is one of the things that really fascinated me. Once the National Park Service came in, y'all could have done whatever you wanted. It was your site. The enabling legislation was there. It's yours to do what you want. But there is always a listening session that comes with every development of a site. It happens everywhere, where they invite the community in to ask what they want to see, and they move from there. What developed out of the listening sessions for this particular site was an interesting kind of development. No, it does not look like this today, and I'll talk a little bit about why. But they got the house, which is going to be a stable house museum, a visitor contact lobby in the building next to the house, a conference hall where they were going to plan to have real academic conferences, which they did hold, a lot of them here at the library, but all kinds of art shows were planned, community events centered in the conference hall, which is actually now the visitor center. And then this area here, they wanted to lease to legacy organizations. And this was something the National Park Service has done before. What that means is they were looking for partners in the community, like the NAACP, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, other legacy organizations, meaning organizations that would have been important to or were important to Maggie Walker or something associated with Walker's mission, to lease these for next to nothing, but also be the ones to fix it up. So again, just to go back to what it looked like. So these were these buildings here, the 3 buildings on the side. That was the original plan. They really wanted people to come in, and so it wasn't going to be completely developed by the National Park Service. It was going to be basically mixed use. And in fact, maybe some apartments above for staff members. That would have been cool, wouldn't it? But that didn't happen. So this is what they actually had approved to be the plan for the site.
So what is the year for that?
So that's 79, general management plan. Yeah. So right away, early. And there are a lot of conversations through the years talking about trying to do this. The fact of the matter is no one wanted to rent the buildings. And so that is why it did not happen that way. So they just couldn't find takers. Not at that time. And so, but it is interesting. I feel like there must have been a lot of conversation that wasn't in the records about trying really hard to keep that going, because these were the last buildings to be renovated. So I think that really, they did try, but it wasn't happening. They were in really bad shape. These buildings were in really bad shape. So I can understand why an organization that's a nonprofit would maybe balk at taking on a lot of that renovation themselves. So that was originally the plan. But again, it did not come through. The other reason why they decided not to do the conference hall is, if you all have been to the visitor center, it's pretty small. So it really would not have accommodated a kind of large-scale conference that I think the folks at that time in 79 were hoping for. So it is a great visitor center, but it just wasn't what was really needed on site at that time. But again, this was what was approved, and then it just had to go through different iterations to what we see today. And of course, then at the same time, the renovations are ongoing inside the house, because that was one thing that was just going to have to happen first. The house was the first structure to open. There had been wallpaper put over wallpaper, so they had to bring it back to as much accuracy as they could. There have been several iterations of wallpaper studies as well. And so now what you go to see today is about as close as it's going to get. One of the coolest things, and other historians said this at the time, about the Maggie Walker house is this is her stuff. As you know, the family, you all know, this was her stuff. She sat in these chairs. She used these glasses. It's really cool, and that is so unusual for any historic house. There were people from Colonial Williamsburg in the study who said they would kill for this kind of thing. So this is something that the Park Service recognized as really critical. They purchased the house, they purchased the items within the house, and also the records related to the house. Any of the diaries, all that stuff was a different transfer. There's a different bill of sale for that. So there had been an inventory done by the Open High School students under the auspices of one of the teachers there, who is also a member of the Historical Foundation, but National Park Service set about to do a real inventory pretty much right away so that we knew what was there. And when I say Maggie Walker stuff was there, it was in drawers. So they had to inventory every single item in every drawer because she was using it that way to her death. So they had to restore both the actual building and the furniture inside the building. So it's not just fixing the structure, it's making sure that everything inside is also restored. And there had been water damage to a lot of items in the house as well. So a lot of the artifacts did need conservation, pretty serious conservation. So all this is just adding up. So you can imagine tens of thousands of dollars that the government in 1978 sets forth and then continues to spend in order to shore up, restore, and interpret this house. At the same time, does anyone here remember Diane Jaycox being down here? Anyone? Okay. I spoke with her. She's in the oral history. She was the Mid-Atlantic Regional Office historian. At the same time that the restoration's going on, Diane Jaycox and other staff historians were starting to dig into the real history, trying to really get a sense of Maggie Walker's life, what she did with the Independent Order of St. Luke, and of course, her legacy. So they were traveling to the Valentine, where there were some IOSL papers. They were coming here, anywhere they could. They were really great at trying to find her organizations that she participated in. So looking at National Association of Colored Women records, stuff like that is where they had to go for the information. And of course, using the materials, the manuscripts that Maggie Walker had left in the home. So often, as those of you who are public historians know, you all have to hire historians to do research, and then you base the exhibit on that. These historians are researching and creating the exhibit at the same time. So there are no really accurate secondary sources at this time to create an exhibit script. So they're having to dig in and do all this work themselves, based on artifacts, based on any available manuscript. And it is in the early 80s that they hired Gertrude Marlowe, a sociologist actually from Howard, to research and eventually publish the book that is one of the few biographies of Maggie Walker. It first came out as a manuscript for the National Park Service, but quite frankly, by the time it was done, the Park Service had actually done a lot of the research already. So they had done their own research to create the exhibit script that you see today. For the most part, it's based very much on the original 1970s, early 80s, and then of course it is updated when we learn new stuff, which we're always doing. So the renovations were ongoing to get it to the point where you see today, but that first early 1978 renovation is not where it ended. Everything from fixing the walls, fixing the plaster, all that had to be done, but also it wasn't until the 21st century that they were able to get accurate curtains. So it's the little stuff that you don't think about in house museums, that you go with what you have, with the money that you've got, and it is always ongoing. As more research is uncovered, you have to change it. So that it's not a static place. And that's what's also really amazing. The historic furnishings reports didn't really come out until the 21st century, the really accurate ones, and that's what the current interpretation is based on. So that costs money too. You got to pay someone to do those. So all this stuff, you can just kind of think about how much money this is costing the federal government to do our Maggie Walker site here in town, which is pretty cool. So this is before and this is after. This is modern. So what you would have seen in 1981 would be the Walker house finished and the others still kind of derelict. And remember, the challenge here too is they own this because they bought this, but they don't own that. So right next to the Walker house, you've still got renters, you've still got challenges on the other side of the block that you can't really control. So just because they say there's an easement on the facade doesn't mean that anyone has to follow it. So that's a kind of a challenge. But they brought it back to the interpretation in the 1920s, 30s, when Maggie Walker would have been living there. So the ironwork's back on the top, the awnings have been put back, and again, this is all based on site reports, research on what the street looked like, what the streetscape looked like, and then a lot of repointing of brick, redoing the roofs. Flat roofs are a complete nightmare, and they're really expensive because you really have to make sure that they're not leaking, and they do leak a lot. And so they worked really hard on this for years, and then work continued on the other buildings. So that's simply the one structure. Again, thousands and thousands of dollars worth. And then once the house was open to the public, when money came available, staff began the plans for 2 Street. And again, I wanted to show you the before and after here. So what they determined to do, once they kind of jettisoned the convention center because it just wasn't a big enough site, so they determined that it would be the visitor center. So they pulled the laundroma. That was an addition onto these old buildings. They pulled that off and then fixed the interiors. And I have it in the book so you can read about what it actually looked like inside. But what's interesting is you may know Cindy Mcleod. I bet some of you in here actually do know Cindy Mcleod. So when she came in, it was not her first visit when she came to take over as superintendent. She had been here in the 70s as an architect for the Mid-Atlantic region to do a site visit. And there weren't ceilings in these buildings. Like, they were dangerous. So there were no roofs on most of these. No ceilings. Everything was messed up inside. So that's what they were dealing with. The visitor center, this is a picture of the opening. There's Cindy right there in her uniform, superintendent uniform. They brought it back to the grocery store, the yellow front there, and then the houses along. It took till 1996 to get this done. And again, if you have ever worked on a historic home or any kind of renovation of anything that's built really before 1980, you know that what you see on the surface is just the surface. So every time they open something up, there was a problem. So it took a long time. It took a really long time, and it was very, very expensive, but they ultimately got this done. So to see what you do today. So that's the visitor center here. And again, done with studies, you couldn't just have an architect, you needed engineers, and we had a lot of people running back and forth from Philadelphia to here, from the regional office here to the site. Also, preservationists from Williamsport, which is one of the key centers of building preservation, and also Harper's Ferry Center, coming here to help with this restoration and renovation. So what I find really interesting and important is that the National Park Service itself recognized the importance of this site. You know, this is a woman who lived in Richmond, who was really important, we know that, but the National Park Service has a lot of sites, and yet they dedicated a tremendous amount of money and energy to this one. And yes, it fit all the initiatives of inclusion. Also, very much a part of the National Park Service's push to be more available to urban residents. That was another big push in the late 20th, early 21st century, the recognition that people lived in cities and needed historic sites to visit. So this is like the perfect site on so many levels. But, you know, we know federal funding. We know how it works and how it doesn't work. And Cindy Mcleod was a big believer in fighting for every grant she could get, and boy, she got them. So this came in from government money to do all this work. And ultimately, the last phase was Lee Street. So this is going to be the vault where all the artifacts are, the permanent exhibit hall that opened in 2005, and right in the front here is the classroom. And on the side, they did put in a room for the Maggie Walker Historical Foundation for meetings. So that was always part of the plan. So they're still there. The staff would go to the meetings and report on all this progress. And you can see what a difference it made. So the Lee Street we know today is, again, this result of a tremendous amount of effort. And the exhibit inside, the one that you see today, was also the product of the research staff was doing, Gertrude Marlowe was doing. She had students helping with that. Elsa Barkley Brown, of course, one of the leading historians of Maggie Walker. They're all contributing to create the story that we know as best we can at this point today. We never know what we might find later, but what you see today is the result of historians doing research as preservationists are doing the restoration and renovation on these buildings. But at the same time, they've got this lovely block, right? But we know Jackson Ward, and we know the threats to Jackson Ward, and they are still there. So they didn't just sit here on their block as staff working on fixing these buildings up. In fact, Cindy Mcleod took the lead, and she was here a decade, so she's a leading preservationist in Richmond to fight the encroachment of development in Jackson Ward. So the National Park Service could have just sat on the block and done their thing, because that's the scope, but instead they teamed up with the Historic Jackson Ward Foundation to fight against what was going on with the Convention Center building. I'm sure, again, you've seen pictures of just the raised blocks of Jackson Ward that Convention Center that's going to bring so much money to Richmond was going to bring. Well, they actually did get funding. Cindy Mcleod particularly, she wrote a lot of grants, and she teamed up with the State Historic Preservation Office and Historic Jackson Ward to get money to move some of the row houses out of the way of destruction. Not all, unfortunately. They also were the leaders. So again, National Park Service, Historic Jackson Ward Foundation, and SHPO for trying to get the Convention Center to face Jackson Ward, because it was the opening, because it was supposed to face away. And so they were able to get City Council to rework it so that it would not turn away from Jackson Ward. Mcleod also was able to nominate Jackson Ward in 1991 for America's Most Endangered Treasures, where it remained a very long time. And so she got it listed as an endangered national treasure because of the development. And it really was, it was a serious problem. We know that there are some buildings that probably, like the Eggleston Motel, that needed to come down. That kind of fell down. The Eggleston Hotel also fell down. But there were a lot of sites that were simply taken down. Cindy Mcleod was also one of the leaders in fighting against the Jackson Center. That is there. She didn't win. It raised, and it was derelict, but still Giles Jackson's office was sitting there, and he was the first African-American lawyer to argue before the Supreme Court here, and they raised his office in order to put up the Jackson Center. She did fight against Eggleston's plans to turn the motel into a 5-story office development. That was something that was ongoing through the 80s. I will say it's unclear to me whether she was successful or whether he just didn't have the money in the end, so it didn't go up. Because if you know now, when I started working over there with y'all, it was just an empty lot that was open, and now there's fencing around it, which means something's going up. So it's not just about this block, it is about saving Jackson Ward. And between 1991 and 2001, development saw the raising of over 100 historically significant structures. So it was the National Park Service teaming up with local people. And Cindy Mcleod actually ended up on Vision 2000, which was kind of the Jackson Ward vision board established by the city to try to direct what was going to happen with development there. She wrote a grant in 1999 to get funding for private citizens to restore homes. And some of the money went to the Armory to fix the roof, Booker T. Washington School, former school, Elks Lodge, and then private owners could apply for that funding as well. So she wrote that grant, sitting there in the office. You can go read it. And that money did not go to the Park Service. It went two owners who applied for that money. So lots of work to try to stave off the destruction of significant historic Jackson Ward buildings. And of course, that's not all, because one of the goals was to work in community partnership. And also, if any of you are familiar with house museums, you know they're static. There's not much you can do to them. They're there, you can't change them. That's interpreting the life of that person. So the staff at the Maggie Walker site has always been really, really aware of the importance of going beyond the site to bring her story out and also to engage the community in. So they worked with the foundation as volunteers to staff booths at all kinds of festivals. The family reunion that's down in Abner Clay Park, the Jubilee that happened on the river, they're always at 2 Street when 2 Street happens, except for COVID. So you will see Maggie Walker sites and booths all over wherever there's a gathering, and they can get the volunteers and staff to run it. So taking that story out. Gina Rogers was on the committee that helped to plan the 2016 statue, of course, and they picked they talked about which Maggie Walker they wanted, the young one or the older one, and this is, of course, what they came up with. And I absolutely love the statue. I go to Gallery 5 a lot, so I'm always like, hey, Ms. Walker. And one of the most poignant things about this is when you go downtown and you see people hanging out, reading it, and it's a gathering space. It's actually, and of course, during the Monument Avenue events, when we saw gatherings at the Lee statue, we also saw them here at Maggie Walker, and people doing dance shows and interpreting and gathering, and it was just really, really cool. So it's become a community site. And in fact, the superintendent spoke at the opening. Dave Ruth spoke at the unveiling of the statue. They also were involved first with the foundation and now with the Governor's School and other partners to run the youth leadership group every year. So there's a Summer Youth Leadership Institute. This is a picture from that. And so they've been very involved with getting kids in to learn about Maggie Walker, to learn about leadership, and to simply send them out better equipped to become leaders in their own community. And that top picture is a picture of Clyde Thomas, who was the curator before Ethan Bullard, helping to preserve the records that the Stallings had in the St. Luke building. So National Park Service went in, helped to make sure that the records were stabilized before they went off to William and Mary for a time, but was always instrumental in making sure that those records came back to the National Park Service, which the Stallings donated to the National Park Service, and they're currently being processed, right? So this is a really awesome new collection because it's based in Maggie Walker's business. So it's business records that the National Park Service has paid to process and conserve that will be available to scholars once it's complete. So they were there at the beginning, and they are now there archiving and making those accessible to the public. And just another note in terms of accessible to the public, this is a site that is really agile in terms of social media. In 2015, it became one of the museums featured in the Google Cultural Institute. So you can take a virtual tour of this at any time, which was great during COVID. Also, there are wonderful digital exhibits. There is a vibrant Facebook page Ben Anderson runs. You can find information on Instagram. So it's all about trying to reach the community with the knowledge that they're not all going to be able to come. So there's always been a focus on community here. There's always been interest in partnering with the community. And it's taken National Park Service money to get the site to where it is, but it's staff and community together that have run the site to make it available and accessible to everyone, if possible. So, does anyone have any questions?
I just
Yes.
First of all, I want to introduce Johnny Mickens, who is Maggie Walker's great-grandson.
Awesome. Hello.
Johnny Mickens the fourth, who is also Liza's brother and her great-great-great.
Awesome. Hello. Thanks for coming. Yay. Do I have a picture in here? I might have a picture. Yeah, I don't. So there's a picture of you in the book too, doing a gravesite ceremony. So of Mick. Yep. Yeah, Liza's in the book too with this picture, but Mick, yes, but Mick was doing the gravesite ceremony, which is another thing. Again, staff, community, Maggie Walker's gravesite, they're all over the place.
So I just want to make one point of clarity. The Summer Youth Institute.
Yes.
That was actually started by the National Park Service ranger named Manama Al-Rai, Twyla Kitts, who was working at the Science Museum of Virginia, and I was president of the foundation. So the school was not involved in that. It was patterned.
No, later. Yeah. So thank you.
So
at first.
Yes. Institute was patterned on the Eleanor Roosevelt leadership model at the Eleanor Roosevelt site.
Nice. Yes, and it was, and you started you started planning in 2005 for that, for the whole thing, and so it was a long time planning, like 2 years of planning.
It was really a year.
Okay.
But it was very intensive.
It was very intensive, yeah, and it went through COVID too, like virtual.
Yes.
So yeah.
It's continued.
Yeah, it continues. Yeah, Agena. Brought it back. Yes.
The school was not involved.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, only like later on, after there was no foundation. Then and quite frankly, the foundation did dissolve. We don't.
After that, the foundation.
Right, and that's when the school came in to do some stuff, the governor's school. But yes, that's right after the foundation dissolved.
It was actually the impetus for the
that's interesting.
The foundation.
So, okay, yeah.
And a lot of it was because the foundation also had met its goals.
Right.
It was a very old membership. Many of them had passed. It was hard recruiting new members. So it was just kind of at a natural ending place. But we were glad that we were able to lay that groundwork for
a lot of groundwork. Yes, and not just that, like excellent programs, open houses, birthday celebrations. So yes, exactly. July 15th. Yep, every year. So yes.
When we were inside.
Yeah. So absolutely, the foundation was really critical, especially in that, let's see what we can do with the community. Yes, for sure. Yeah. Ben and then Sarah.
For folks who may not be aware, I know you kind of started us, when the park Historical Foundation has just been formed, but it's an interesting story. If you can run us through what happens to the house when Maggie Walker passes away.
Okay. So yes, it goes to her son, and one of the daughter-in-law, who's not married to the son who received it, actually took it over. And she held on to it with the intention of doing something like this. But this is, how many rooms are in the house?
28.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So this is a private citizen who's holding this house with the intention of turning it into some sort of museum. Which is, and this is part of the reason we don't have a lot of artifacts from a lot of historic homes is they do get spread to the descendants. But she didn't let that happen. She held them. And so that, she put in a caretaker because she didn't live there. She didn't live in Richmond. So that's really where it was. It went to her daughter, Maggie Laura Walker Lewis. And that was the woman who owned the home when the foundation was involved. So the plan was to purchase the home from Dr. Lewis and then turn it into the museum. So the family had kept it intact for decades. But it was not, because it's a 20-room house, they didn't have the funds to maintain it. They kept it intact with all the artifacts. And that's why I said, they weren't here. They're not here. Maggie Laura Lewis was in Chicago. So they are absentee. They put in someone to caretake. But that's a lot of money. And so it was decades of being held but not maintained. But yes, that was absolutely the plan. So that's, for 4 decades essentially, the family had this house, and again, all the artifacts and all the manuscripts sitting inside. Yeah.
It was like a time capsule.
It really is a time capsule. And that's why it doesn't usually happen in historic homes, because they split it all up and it goes wherever it goes. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty cool.
On the park system, I think, is the John Adams house in Quincy.
Yes. And that's because they lived there forever too. They just lived in that house for, yeah. It's rare, not just in the Park Service, it's just rare. Just in general with any historic home. Yeah. Yeah, Sandy.
Did you find in doing the research any pushback in the Richmond community, the white community? Why are we spending this kind of money? Why are we doing this? I mean, Maggie Walker was one of the most respected people.
Yes.
When she died. I mean, if you read
Yes, she was.
And there
Mm-hmm.
was black as well as white Richmonders. And yet, this is the 1970s. Not long after the centennial of the American Civil War and all the Confederate stuff.
Yes.
So
I did not, and I'll tell you why. Here's what I think is really interesting. It's also the time after the Supreme Court lifted the injunction and we had a total sweep of the city council. So I'm not seeing what the citizens are saying, but the council was all on board. So this is Marsh. This is the time when stuff's going to happen, because finally we have representation on the council. And honestly, what I heard most, or what I read most from white Richmonders is how bad it was in Jackson Ward. I don't think it was even on their radar, because they didn't go there. They did not go there. And they were told to not go there, or they had heard to not go there. So, right. It's not their space. Let them have their space. And so since it wasn't Richmond money and it wasn't Virginia money, it wasn't taxpayer money that way. It's the big picture. So I think that's part of it, is they're not seeing their bank account paying for this. And I don't think they really cared one way or another. It's just there, but they're not interested or against it.
and probably not even cognizant.
Right, exactly. They don't know what's going on down there.
On their radar.
Because, yeah, it's crime, it's dangerous, we don't go there. I mean, that's what you hear from people at that time, from the white people who don't know what the heck's going on down there. Yep. Yes.
I have a question and a comment. Is there a correlation in either of the Maggie L. Walker home or in the Consolidated Bank that correlates those two? A lot of people don't
Yes.
know that Consolidated Bank is actually, as I was
St. Luke Penny Bank. Yes, St. Luke Penny Sings. Yes. So, yes, they actually donated money. So they were big supporters. So the foundation was there in the 70s, well, really through dissolution, to raise money from private entities to support the work of the National Park Service. So they're one of the big donors. So Consolidated sponsored a lot of events and also gave money and published a really cool brochure that's still in the archives.
And is the Consolidated Bank on the list of potential National Historic Sites, since that's one of the first African-American owned banks?
I don't know, not that I know of, but that's...
The Consolidated Bank, it's dissolved. It was bought by Dolly Madison,
Okay.
and then it was turned into Premier. It was Dolly Madison Bank for about a year and a half. Then it was turned into Premier Bank, and now it's People's Bank.
Right.
But
Yeah.
the bank was actually in failure when the 100th anniversary of the bank came around.
Okay.
So the foundation was able to sponsor the 100th anniversary celebration. And it was quite a lovely event. I don't know if you'll look at it.
Yeah.
There was a tent next to the museum, next to the bank, and it was still called Consolidated.
Mm-hmm.
So,
That
and
time.
Next year, I think it was sold to them.
Yeah.
Got it.
But yes, they were big supporters.
Absolutely.
My comment is just thank you for.
Oh my gosh.
I'm glad that the National Park Service has identified the home as a National Historic Site because it is part of our country's history.
Absolutely.
And I'm not from Richmond, but I know a lot about Maggie Walker, and it's just wonderful that you all have made sure that her history stays known by everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, very encouraging to women and especially business owners.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. It's so critical. It really is astonishing how little people talked about her after her death, really for decades. And then it's the foundation and the Park Service really help to tell the story that should never have been lost. So, yeah.
The naming of the school is also important,
Mm-hmm.
and so at least her name was not totally forgotten because
Right.
there's a school
Yep.
named for her. So people all over, they would play all throughout, even Tidewater.
Mm-hmm.
So they would know that they were coming to, Maggie Walker School, not necessarily knowing
Know who she is.
Sadly,
Yeah.
a lot of the students that attend there now
I know.
still don't quite understand her full impact because of the way the school was designed.
Mhm.
So
Mm-hmm.
gifted education school, but anyway.
Yeah, and I should say, like, locally, Jackson Ward knew Maggie Walker. They never forgot Maggie Walker. They didn't forget who she was. But it was the way that, we knew Mary Mcleod Bethune. We knew other really, Mary Church Terrell, other super important business. Of course, I know, staff, you can always talk about how people still think Maggie Walker is Madam C.J. Walker. So there are plenty of other African American women whose stories were not lost to the kind of national narrative the way hers was. So she was never like completely forgotten, but it's more the fact that there are these icons in Black women's history, and I feel like she should be in there, and she's not. So. Right, exactly. Yeah, she hung out with Mary Mcleod Bethune. They're buds. So it's really, yes. So that's what the difference is she didn't kind of make it to that Bethune tier or Madam C.J. Walker tier, but she's always known in the community itself. Yeah.
And she is part of
Yes.
the Virginia State Standards.
Yes, she
So
is.
It's good to see kids all across the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Reading about someone actually from Virginia.
Yes.
In addition to a lot
Absolutely.
of the national figures.
We have people from Alaska who are contacting us to do distance learning because, as soon as they learn, they say, why haven't we heard about it?
Right. That's, yes.
We have a school in Alaska
Yes.
that does this every year. It's just, the word does get out.
That's exactly it. It's about why, that's really the story, is why haven't we? It's not that we should, it's that we should have always. But as I always tell people too, not many famous Virginians have 2 statues in Richmond. So.
But is it true that the National Park Service, this is the only historic site that, I think you said it as well, that has been recognized, an African American historic site recognized by the National Park Service?
Not anymore.
Okay.
And there were 2, I think, if you count Bethune's,
So Mary
statue. But
Walker.
not really, though. Not in '78. There was she's memorialized, but not as a site.
Gotcha.
So, it was one of the earliest, and the only one of a woman at that time. So, again, they're working on it. So, yeah, it's the statue. It's the statue. So that was there, but nothing that's a site that's significant like this. Yeah. Council House is 82. Yeah, so it's later. Yeah. It's the first one in '78. So that's pretty cool that we've got it. Yeah. Yep.
So the wonderful thing is now that the Park Service is doing such a great job
Yes.
of disseminating the records and doing a lot
Yes.
of deep research. Thank you all so much because so many holes have been filled in.
Absolutely.
And now the story can be told almost, to
Exactly. And to make it available to everyone. And that's the thing, is this is the public's. We own it. So it's available to anyone who wants to learn, and that's the best.